And so what I talked to the librarian, and she says it's a great idea that I'll give a full talk this fall. So look for it. You're only going to get the highlights, and hopefully it'll whet your appetite. So what do we have here? We have an old homestead, and we have a picture of the Victorian house that was here. That was not the original house. The original house was an old 1.5-story farmhouse that I believe was here before 1800. And before 1800, this land was owned by none other than Ben Chaplin, the founder of Chaplin. Ben, when he died in 1795, he owned nearly 2,000 acres in this part of Chaplin. That's almost 4 square miles. And I believe it was all the way to the brook and all the way to Ashford Line. And of course it got sold off. And when he died, it would have all gone to his son Ben Jr., except that Ben Jr. died before Ben Sr. did. So it was divided amongst four daughters that he had. So they each got a big chunk of land. And this particular property was given to Hannah Chaplin, who was one of his daughters, and she was married to the Reverend David
Avery.
Right?
Yep.
And this is known as the Avery Farm, this property right here. And in the previous old farmhouse, part of history was that the very first meeting of the Chaplin Congregational Church was held in that house right here in 1815. When this was not Chaplin, this was Mansfield at that time. So it was the Avery Farm, and then there was a very influential family named Rosses and Chaplin. They had mills, and they were. And William Ross came and bought this property and brought his bride, Miranda, here at the age of 22 to live in this house. Not this house, but the older house. And William and his bride lived here for like 53 years. And William was a farmer. He traded cattle, first of all. But he was not only a farmer, but he was a businessman, and a very successful businessman. He came to purchase a lot of rental properties in Willimantic and actually owned a silk mill in Willimantic. And he made lots of money and became, this was the richest family in Chaplin by far. We would probably call them multi-millionaires now. And so he's the one, he originally bought about 172 acres on both sides, but he expanded it to over 300 acres by purchasing the neighboring farm, which the house is still there. The trust has sold that house along with 3 acres last year. So it's not part of the property anymore, but it was part of William Ross's property. So William Ross was a very key person. He had one son, William Jr., and William Jr. inherited everything. I believe he was still living at home. He was not married, but he inherited everything and continued all the business activities in Willimantic and beyond. I believe they even had some properties down on the shore in Old Saybrook. So then we go to William Jr. Well, William Jr. was getting on in age, and he was taking care of the rentals in Willimantic. And he met this, I think through his rentals, he met Emily. He met Emily Jones Clark, who was renting property with her husband in Willimantic. I believe. You can believe that if you want. But I know she was renting property in Willimantic, and he was collecting the rent. So add two and two together. Well, she divorced her husband, and she married William Jr., and he was like 70 years old, and she was like 16 years her junior, his junior. So they got married, and of course they owned all the property and all the rest of the estate. And then that was in 19. Let me get this straight. Good thing I brought my crib sheet here. 1904. They were married, but he died in 1908, and all the property then came to Emily. Well, wouldn't you know, the probate was challenged. I wonder why, by an uncle. And there was a famous probate court, and probate court was held in Chaplin, and actually Emily won out and got the property. Then, a few years later, well, Emily, she was another key character in this whole story, in this whole chapter of Chaplin history. Emily, when William Ross II died, he left money for a library in town, and we know we have the old Ross Library, and so that was built, and supposedly Emily actually directed the building of that library. And then in 1917, she got married again. She became Emily Jones Clark Ross. Emily Vale. We all knew this as the Vale property in the day. And Vale was her chauffeur and was 15 years younger than she.
How convenient.
It should be a TV show.
It should be, yeah.
A new streaming.
Okay,
I know, Netflix series that lasts 12 episodes.
She eventually passed away in 1933. And who did she leave the property to?
Chauffeur.
Her hubby? No. She left it. She left it to her son of the first marriage, who was Walter Clark, a very famous person in United States history, actually. And I don't have time to talk about Walter too much, but he ended up owning the property, and Walter Vale was able to stay here, get life residency he had. And he lived here till 1944 with a couple of servants. They were very well off, having a chauffeur and a cook and house servants here. So then in 1944, the house kind of went vacant. The owner was Clark. Walter Clark was living in Charleston, West Virginia, and he, I wouldn't say he mismanaged it, but they were renting the neighboring house through those years, and a short period during the 1950s, they rented this property to the Griswold family. We'll talk about them a little bit later. but it was kind of not being maintained that well. So we now go to the year of 1964, and in that year was the year that a young family showed up here. Bill Rose was just mentioning that. They're from France, and there was 2 children, and the kids in this neighborhood got to play with them. They stayed here for the summer, this family from France. And the kids were hoping they'd come back the next year, but they never did. And it turns out that one of the kids was the granddaughter of Walter, of the owner, and who had passed away. So her mother was actually the daughter was the owner of the property, Juliet Clark Alexander. And at that time, we called this the Alexander Place because it was under a trust called the Alexander Trust. So anyhow, then the next thing that happened here, other than the kids playing around in the house and amongst the walls around here, was in September 12, 1973. There was a spectacular midnight fire that burned the whole house down, pretty much the whole house. I talked to some of the neighbors that came out of bed and watched the fire. So then we go. That was in 1972, and it was pretty much abandoned. The whole property. The Joshua's Trust, from time to time, would send a letter to the Alexander Trust and see if there was any interest in preserving the property. And then we didn't hear from them until I got a call from a lady who lived in Delaware. This is when I was more active. I was active with acquisitions in the trust, and this lady wanted to know if the property was offered to the trust, would we take it? Of course.
Kind of no-brainer.
So anyhow, that brings us up to today. There's a lot of other stories that can be told, but I just don't have time. But I would like to relate a little bit of the church connection with this property. First of all, when they had that probate action, the newspapers reported, it was big headlines, and in the newspaper article, it mentioned that my grandfather, Clifton Church, was a witness for Emily. So he must have been influential. Then, in 1934, my mother came to town. And she took a job. She was escaping a boyfriend out in the western part of the state. And so she came here and took a job to take care of an elderly lady who I believe was Emily's sister, Eva, because Emily died in 1933.